Hey guys, my name is Sanatan and this is my Saab 95 Aero that I picked up on Marketplace for 1100 bucks. In the previous episode, I did a quick overview of the car where I talked about all the things that will need work. I briefly went over the radiator, mentioning that there was a tiny leak that was slowly getting worse, so in this video I'll be replacing said radiator. I encountered some pretty interesting things while replacing the radiator, so without further ado, let's get right into it. The first thing I did to try and slow down the leak until I could source a radiator was use JB Weld. However, this only worked for a few days and the leak came back even stronger than before. At this point, I looked into getting a new radiator and ended up going with a Nissan's radiator on Rock Auto. I picked it up for about 170 Canadian dollars, and from what I found online, the auto and manual cars both use the same radiator, the only difference being the transmission fluid cooling lines which needed to be connected on the automatic cars. I also bought a temperature sensor and a thermostat for the replacement. After waiting about a week, the parts came, so I was finally able to begin with the swap. The first thing I did was try to get some space so I could access the bolts of the radiator fan. I did this by removing the intake tubes and the exhaust header heat shield. I was trying to be super careful with the little plastic brackets and hoses as everything was brittle and dried out. The bracket holding the air intake hose was also cracked, so eventually I'll try sourcing another one of those. The heat shield also looks like shit, so I'll eventually get around to painting that as well. I then prepared to drain my coolant system. Near the bottom of the radiator there's a tiny plastic clip you need to turn clockwise. At this point I was adding new coolant every week to the engine, so I planned to reuse some of this coolant later as it was practically brand new and all the other coolant had probably slowly leaked out over the course of a couple months. After draining the coolant, I could then begin taking off the wiring clips and hoses from the radiator fan. I then took out the two fan bolts and removed the radiator fan. The bolts securing the fan were 10mm. I also made sure to inspect the hoses as I took them off. The hoses surprisingly were in decent condition. They weren't dried or cracked and some had already been replaced before. Once the fan was out, I could see the larger hoses connected to the radiator which needed to be removed, and in total there were 3. I kind of struggled with the hose at the bottom right of the radiator. It was really stuck on there, so I used a dish soap water spray to get some lubrication between the radiator plastic and the hose. Once the hoses were disconnected, the radiator could easily be pulled out. I was surprised to see no screws holding the radiator in place. It rests on pegs and stays in place because of everything surrounding it. I removed the hose that was still attached to the old radiator, gave it a quick clean, and put it aside so it could be installed on the new radiator. After removing the radiator, I moved on to the thermostat housing. Getting the bolts of the thermostat housing were really annoying and took some time, but after a bit of struggling, I was able to get it out. This is how the thermostat housing looks when removed from the engine block. The bolt pattern is 13 for the top and bottom bolts, and 10mm for the left and right bolts. When I stuck my hand into the coolant passage to pull out the thermostat, I was shocked when only half of it came out. To be honest, I don't know how it was still functioning up until that point. I'm assuming because everything was enclosed in the housing, it didn't break apart inside and still managed to function somehow. Next, it was time to clean the thermostat housing and the corresponding area on the engine block. There was a sticky residue on it, but I think that was just the gasket which had disintegrated onto the housing over time. The only damage I could find was a little chip along the edge of the housing, but it wasn't leaking before, so I'm confident that this won't be an issue. Taking some time to clean the thermostat housing and the corresponding area on the engine block, I put in the new thermostat. It's important to make sure that the little bleeder hole is oriented at the top of the thermostat when installing it. While you have the thermostat housing out, you might as well also replace the temperature sensor. I purchased a temperature sensor off of Rock Auto, but it wasn't an OEM sensor and I didn't want to risk replacing my functioning sensor, causing more problems. I'll make sure to replace it once I get my hands on an OEM sensor though. To replace the sensor, make sure you have a deep 19mm socket so you have enough space to clear the plug connector and make contact with the bolt. Once the thermostat was installed and the housing was screwed back in, I moved on to installing the radiator. This part was a lot easier than taking everything out. The hoses were easier to install and there was a lot more space to work. The radiator hoses at the bottom were still hard to reach, but with a little adjustment, I was able to get them tightened as well. Then it was just a matter of putting everything that had been taken off back on, including the radiator fan, the wiring, and the air intake tube. Did you catch my mistake? We'll get to that in a second, but everything was connected and ready to go, so I filled the coolant back into the system and I was ready to start the car, and this is what happened. Yeah, I know. I honestly panicked when I saw the smoke and heard it misfire, but I'm pretty sure the smoke was just the coolant I spilled on the headers burning off. And the car was on for 18 seconds. Turned it off and went to check everything once again. Checked my air intake hose. I noticed that this one vacuum line was disconnected. I connected the hose, started the car again, and this is what happened. Car ran totally fine and idled perfectly, and the thermostat also opened up after a while and the coolant started circulating throughout the engine. And I wish I could say that that was all for this video, but after a few months of driving around, I noticed my coolant reservoir was empty again, and that there was a puddle of coolant underneath my car. After some investigating, I noticed that the coolant heater bypass valve was leaking, so I had to replace that as well. So the first thing I did was get some hose clamp pliers and get to work. Honestly, it would have been nicer to replace the valve while I was doing the radiator job because there isn't much room to work with and squeezing your arm through the tiny gaps isn't fun. Replacing the valve itself was pretty simple. It's just removing 3 hoses and swapping it out. I highly recommend buying these long reach hose clamp pliers. This will make your life way easier as it felt almost impossible to get the tiny pliers into the small crevices. The replacement part arrived and I immediately went to install it the next day. When installing the new valve, the space is pretty much the only difficult thing to work around. The better your tools, the easier it'll be to get the old valve off and the new valve on. I bought my pliers from Amazon. They weren't the best quality, but I made them work for this job. If I ever have a job that requires getting into an even tighter place, I might invest in some better pliers. As you can see here, I was able to install one of the hoses outside. The other 2 hoses had to be connected at the heater valve's original location. And after all of that, I refilled my coolant for the 100th time, started the car once again. This time there were no leaks and the car has been maintaining operating temperature much better than before. When I used to turn on my heat before, I noticed that my coolant temp needle would drop slightly, but that doesn't happen anymore. So maybe that was a sign, I don't know. But yeah, that's all for this video. Thanks again for watching. I've added links to useful forums below that help me with information and tips for the repairs. That's all I've got for now. I appreciate you guys watching and I'll see you in the next one.